You've never seen anything like it, because there's never been anything like it.
Back in 1984, Chrysler introduced a new vehicle that would revolutionize the car industry, the Dodge Caravan, and its corporate twin, the Plymouth Voyager. Originally conceived as a garageable van, but would soon be known as the minivan, essentially a front-wheel drive tall station wagon with a sliding door, and it quickly became one of Chrysler's most popular vehicles. Ford and GM quickly scrambled to make their own minivans, as did Japanese rivals, but for the next 2 decades, none could unseat Chrysler as the market leader. This is part 1 of the story of the Plymouth Voyager, the Chrysler Town Country, and most notable for me, the Dodge Caravan, a car I once owned, making this episode true to this channel's name, My Old Car.
Dodge Caravan, even its standard protection plan makes it a transportation revolution.
So if you are a regular viewer of my channel, first of all, of course, thanks for your support these past 18 months. But as a regular viewer, you may recall that my first 6 episodes featured cars that I once owned, hence the name of my channel. But you may also recall that I skipped one of the cars I owned, a 1994 Dodge Caravan. And why did I skip it? Well, I'll get to that later. Because there's so much history to talk about here, I am keeping the focus of this episode to just the first 2 generations of the Caravan, from 1984 to 1995. In a follow-up episode, I will explore the 3rd and later generations.
Dodge Caravan is a transportation revolution.
Prior to the introduction of Chrysler's minivans, the idea of a van in North America was usually not considered to be mini.
Beautiful, BA.
As vans typically were built on truck frames with rear-wheel drive and far taller than cars to accommodate more cargo. Although lengthwise, they were often far shorter than many sedans or even some coupes back in the 70s. Smaller vans were available in the 70s, most notably the Volkswagen Vanagon, which originated with the VW bus in the 60s, and whose T3 generation began in 1979 and lasted until 1990. American automakers had their own competitors in the 60s, with the first-gen Ford Econoline, the Chevy Corvair Greenbrier, and the Dodge A100. But although these vans tried to market themselves more as family vehicles as opposed to work trucks, they all were cab-over designs, with the driver sitting above the front axle, not a minivan design as we would recognize today. Compare that to the DeKalb Schnellnaster, which in English means rapid transporter, made by Auto Union in the 1950s. It was sold in Europe, had front-wheel drive, and a transversely mounted engine. I suspect few in the Western Hemisphere even know this van existed, but it was closer in design to the modern minivan than most of the competitors that followed. Despite the existence of the DeKalb Schnellnaster, Chrysler is usually given credit in the history books for introducing the concept of the minivan. However, Ford had considered something similar in 1972 with its carousel concept. GM revealed a concept in 1979 called the Chevy Nomad 2, based on the then new GM X-Body platform. And even AMC had considered something sort of like a van in 1977, the AM van, that was based on the Pacer platform. Excellent! But none of these were considered for production. However, the Dodge division of Chrysler had also experimented with the idea of what they called a garageable van in the early 70s, around the time Ford was planning their carousel. But Chrysler management would soon shelve that plan, arguing that if the market for such a vehicle existed, Ford and GM would already have one by that point. But by 1977, with no competition being considered from Ford or GM, the minivan development started up again at Chrysler. But it was slow going, as Chrysler's finances were in no shape to take on such an expensive project. At that time, both front and rear-wheel drive platforms were being considered, the latter primarily to help cut costs by using existing platforms. But once Lee Iacocca and fellow Mustang developer Hal Sperlich had left Ford and joined Chrysler, they helped spearhead the decision to go with what they dubbed the Mini-Max, referring to its combination of minimum exterior but maximum interior. The Mini-Max would have a front-wheel drive platform, which allowed for a lower load floor and therefore easier to step into and drive, as they had mothers in mind for potential target buyers. And it had to be shorter in height than a typical van, so it could fit in an average-sized garage. It also would have its engine farther from the driver to provide a larger crush zone in the event of an accident, far different than typical full-size vans. It would share its engine and drivetrain, as well as many other interior pieces, with the K-Car sedans also in development at that same time. Although the K-Car and minivan platforms were technically different, the front-wheel drive K-Car platform served as a starting point in the design, but it had leaf springs to support the rear solid axle, as was typical for a van. Codenamed the T115 project, the development of the minivan would eventually cost $500 million US, much of that coming from the $1.5 billion Chrysler got in federal loans to save it from bankruptcy. Suffice it to say, if it wasn't for that bailout, what we know today as a minivan, if such a thing ever happened, could be much different. Then there is the name itself, the Caravan, a very clever combination of car and van, which is exactly what a minivan was intended to be. Dodge would get this name for its version, and they also sold one called the Mini Ram Van, a caravan with the side windows removed behind the B-pillars, and the back seats removed. However, for Plymouth, the naming wasn't nearly as clever, as they chose the name Voyager, that had already been used on the Plymouth version of the Dodge Sportsman full-size van.
But the nicest thing about Voyager is, it's a Plymouth.
And just like they did with the K cars, there was almost no visible difference between the Caravan and Voyager. During its early reveals to the press, rumor has it that they simply brought badges for both cars, and switched them when they needed to show each model. Production cars would be fitted with slightly different grills, as the only other way to tell them apart.
Catch the Voyager at your local Chrysler Plymouth dealer.
Sharing the base engine of the Dodge Aries and Plymouth Reliant, a 2.2-liter four-cylinder making 96 horsepower, may have helped bring the minivans to market quicker, but they soon proved to be very inadequate for the heavier minivan. Thanks to their partnership with Mitsubishi, it also offered their 2.6-liter four, which only gained 8 more horses. The Chrysler-built engine came standard with a manual transmission, something that younger viewers may find hard to believe, but considering the K cars offered them as well, it was a natural fit, and allowed for a lower starting price. Not so with the optional Mitsubishi engine, which could only be had with a 3-speed automatic. The 5-speed manual, although a torque that would be considered poor by today's standards, was still better than the automatic. The Caravan and Voyager also had versatility that was unmatched in vehicles their size, with the ability to remove the second and third row bench seats, or even move the larger third row bench to the second row. This versatility, however, required 2 relatively strong people to move the seats, which Chrysler usually wouldn't highlight in their ads. There was even a place to connect a hook strap to allow the rear hatch to be open when carrying longer items. Yes, that was a great way for the car's occupants to breathe in the exhaust fumes. Another oddity was the lack of a glove box in its usual location, instead moved to a bin underneath the front passenger seat. But even with low engine power and seats that were difficult to move, the minivan's target demographic didn't care. It was new and different. It was easy to drive. It was shorter than many cars of the time. In fact, it was 2 inches shorter than a K-car wagon, but it had double the cargo capacity. You could get it as a 5-passenger van with no third row bench seat, or could fit up to 8 with an optional front row bench seat, although the front bench option was rare and ended by 1987. To appeal to longtime wagon owners, simulated wood grain sides became a popular feature. Minivans kept the most distinguishing feature of full-size vans, the sliding door on the passenger side.
You need a magic wagon, Plymouth Voyager.
Early on in the design was consideration for another sliding door on the driver's side, but Chrysler execs still wanted to consider the minivan for commercial use, where a single door was better at managing cargo. Plus, a single door maintained structural rigidity better, not to mention it was cheaper to engineer. As you would expect, TV advertising for the first generation Caravan and Voyager was extensive, and although today it is hard to watch these ads and still keep a straight face,
Plymouth Voyager, the magic wagon. You gotta drive it to believe it.
it couldn't have been more clear to see how much pride Chrysler had with effectively creating a whole new automotive market. And it didn't take long for the competition to see it either. Ford and GM quickly hurried their own minivans into production, with the Ford Aerostar in 1986.
I drove it to the prom.
And the Chevy Astro and GMC Safari in 1985. But each of these vehicles were essentially modified rear-wheel drive trucks, and as a result were taller and drove less like a car than the Caravan and Voyager did. Toyota got a head start with their 1983 model, simply known then as the Toyota van, but it was more akin to the cab-over design that some full-size vans had.
I wonder if it's a car. I wonder if it's a van.
It looks like nothing you've ever seen before.
And was too bizarre for most American buyers, only lasting until 1987. By that same year, Nissan and Mitsubishi offered similar-looking models, also with names of either van or wagon. Nissan's van was such a failure due to its propensity to catch fire that Nissan bought back and crushed almost every one they made. None of the Japanese models came anywhere close to the sales that Chrysler did, making them a rare find today.
For the newest in vans, the name is Nissan.
GM and Ford did better with their minivan attempts, but were always playing catch-up with Chrysler. Little changed with the Caravan and Voyager into 1986, but 1987 was the first refresh, which switched the quad headlamps to twin composite units.
Powerfully new Dodge Caravan and Plymouth Voyager, best built right here in Canada.
But a more important introduction that year was the Grand Caravan and Grand Voyager. Unlike the longer version of the Ford Aerostar, which simply added on more length to the end behind the rear axle, the Chrysler models extended the wheelbase by 7 inches and overall length by 14 inches. All that extra length required more power, so Mitsubishi's 3-liter V6 was offered, bringing horsepower up to 136. The Grand models were a big hit, increasing overall sales across both models by 20 to 30% by 1988. Caravans were still the top seller by far, with over 230,000 in sales for 1988, compared to over 140,000 Voyagers that same year.
The 9 most important words Plymouth knows. Satisfy the customer. Satisfy the customer. Satisfy the customer.
Starting in 1988, Chrysler began offering its minivan to the European market. However, with neither the Dodge or Plymouth nameplates existing there, it was branded there as the Chrysler Voyager. There it competed with a similarly sized and shaped vehicle from Renault that began in 1984, which most Americans would probably pronounce as E-Space, but I think the correct pronunciation was probably closer to Espace. So for my European viewers, let me know how close I got on that one. I say that the Renault was similarly sized and shaped, but not a minivan, since it had 4 conventionally opening doors, so it lacked what makes a minivan, the sliding door. Back when Renault had taken over American Motors, there was some consideration to import the Espace to the US, but that idea was obviously shelved once Chrysler bought AMC from Renault in 1987. In early 1989, the Chrysler brand finally got its own version of the minivan, the Town & Country, a name that began as far back as 1941, and which Chrysler had only just retired from use on its station wagons the previous year. A bit of useless trivia here, but the name Town & Country was the only car to ever have a non-alphabetic character in its name, that being the ampersand. Although outside it visually was not too much different from the Caravan and Voyager, except for the front grille and badging. Inside, the Town & Country offered most all the Caravan and Voyager options as standard, as well as leather seating. Its goal was to compete with the Eddie Bauer model of the Ford Aerostar, which had been introduced in 1988, so Ford managed to hold the advantage of having a luxury-themed minivan for a short time before Chrysler. 1989 also saw the introduction of GM's biggest and most expensive attempt to compete directly with Chrysler by developing its now infamous dustbuster vans.
Cleans up little messes, 1, 2, 3.
Across its Chevrolet, Pontiac, and Oldsmobile brands. The goal of the GM vans was to look much more futuristic than the boxy Chrysler models, but their polarizing design turned off many potential buyers and hasn't aged well, although the few that remain in good condition may actually be worth something today. I did a whole episode on these vans, so be sure to check that one out if you haven't already.
I mean, it is the Cadillac of minivans.
Although casual observers may not have noticed, 1991 was the start of the second generation of the Chrysler minivans. I say that casual observers may not have noticed, since from the side view, the basic square shape remained, as did the length of both the standard and extended wheelbase versions, and even the doors carried over unchanged. But from the A-pillars forward, along with the rear hatch, were a considerable redesign. The rear leaf springs were upgraded to coil springs, and it had a redesigned dash with a driver's airbag. Integrated child safety seats were introduced as an option in 1992. This generation would also see the introduction of an all-wheel drive model, then to compete with Ford, who had offered it on the Aerostar.
Hello?
With the original K-cars now out of production, engines and transmissions were shared with cars like the Dodge Spirit and Plymouth Acclaim, and the larger Chrysler sedans like the New Yorker and Fifth Avenue. Although Chrysler-built 4-cylinder and Mitsubishi V6s were still available, a Chrysler-built 3.3-liter V6 was now available, making 150 horsepower, which would be upgraded to a 3.8-liter unit by 1994, making 162 horsepower. Dodge still offered a commercial van option, but it was now called the Caravan CV, and although the Town & Country technically still came standard with the simulated wood grain sides, by 1992 you could opt out, and it was no longer an option for the Caravan by 1994. The Town & Country was also finally available with what they called quad seating, with bucket seats in the second row. Speaking of 1994, that also happens to be the model year of the Dodge Caravan I once owned. I mentioned in the beginning of this episode that I would eventually talk about my Caravan. My experience with it was somewhat short-lived, having owned it for less than 2 years. As a guy who loved playing with toy cars as a kid, and grew up into a big kid who still loved to play with cars, the car I drove became a reflection of who I was. In 1994, I was driving a car I loved at the time, a 92 Dodge Daytona. But then my wife and I welcomed our firstborn son in March of 94, and getting a baby carrier in the back seat of a Daytona simply wasn't going to work long term. Back then, minivans had become the car to own for new moms. They loved it, whereas most guys, at least those that I knew, Hated them. I reluctantly succumbed to my wife's decision to trade in the Daytona for a 1994 Caravan. I tried to like it, I really did, but when the first generation Dodge Intrepid was released, that looked so much better, and I wished each day to get one of those instead. My wife grew so sick of my complaining that she allowed me to sell the Caravan and replace it with a low mileage used 95 Intrepid. She later got her own Caravan, this time a 96 model, new for the third generation, which at the time looked less dorky, and I may have been more willing to own. The third generation was a huge deal for Chrysler, almost as big as the original in 1984. I'll delve more into that one and the generations that followed in a later episode. Like all the cars I feature in my videos, I rarely ever see a first or second gen Caravan or Voyager nowadays, except maybe at car shows, like this one that I posted on my Instagram page. Despite how much I hated driving mine, I totally get why Chrysler's minivan was so revolutionary. Like Ford's Model T, it wasn't meant to portray luxury or opulence. It was meant for the masses of people who simply needed it out of necessity. And let's face it, when most people think of Chrysler in the 80s, the minivan is likely the car that comes to mind first. Thanks for watching. If you liked this video, click the like button and subscribe to my channel. If you once owned a car from the 80s to mid-2000s that you rarely see today and would like it featured in a future episode, leave a reply in the comments or contact me at the email shown here. See you next time.
In the minivan business, you lead, follow, or get out of the way.